William Shakespeare is known the world over for being one of the best playwrights in the world. But he didn't only write plays, he also wrote sonnets. Which leads us to this week's question of, did Shakespeare write poems? Yes, William Shakespeare did write poems. In fact, he wrote a lot of them. But why did he write so many poems? It turns out he wrote them because of the plague. In the years 1593 to 1594, London shut down the playhouses because of an outbreak of plague. Thousands and thousands of people died, and the congregating masses of people that would be packed in there together in the theater was a breeding ground for plague. It was a great place to catch the plague, and while there were a few people who felt that the unsavory nature of the location of the playhouse contributed spiritually somehow to the idea of the plague latching on there and making some metaphorical references, it was, in fact, just medically speaking, it's kind of like when you have a cold, you don't want to go out and shake hands with people or you'll give them the cold. Well, when you have the plague, when you get lots of people together, it's easier to catch. And so the playhouses would increase the rates of plague, and because of that, they would close it down. Well, as a playwright, if your playhouse gets shut down, you still have to find a way to make money. And Shakespeare would make money by writing sonnets. He wrote 154 of these sonnets, and it was basically the way to pay the bills when the theater was closed. He would write them for patrons, like Henry the Earl of Southampton, whose last name is almost impossible for me to pronounce. So, Henry the Earl of Southampton is what we're going to call him for the sake of this video, and I'll put the spelling in the show notes and you can go look him up. But basically, he was a man who paid Shakespeare to write these sonnets, and it was a kind of noble charity. It was considered important for the nobility to share their wealth and status with people who didn't have the same wealth and status by being a patron of their work. They would donate money to support the business of the arts because it was a popular and expected thing to do. And the Earl of Southampton was one of Shakespeare's patrons, and so one way for Shakespeare to make money when the playhouses were closed and he couldn't perform his plays was to write sonnets for people that paid him to do so. Sonnets 1 through 126 are actually dedicated to a fair youth, and one of the more popular opinions about who the fair youth is that he was actually dedicating these plays to the Earl of Southampton. It's worth noting that a lot of the romantic and amour sort of language that goes into the play, or the sonnets, was because that was the sonnet's function. It was a love poem venue as a way to express love. And love was not considered amorous or sexual in the time of Shakespeare necessarily. It could have also been a way of expressing admiration and respect for the Earl of Southampton and a closeness. We know that the Earl of Southampton frequented the theater and was hugely a big fan of plays and performances, and so he went and saw these plays all the time. Shakespeare would have seen him, and he was just had a very close relationship with Shakespeare, and so it's just as likely that Shakespeare was writing these sonnets in this format because that was the proper format of the sonnet to honor or respect, as opposed to providing some kind of actual personal love. Now, it's equally possible that Shakespeare actually harbored a love for the Earl of Southampton, and that's why it's debated by scholars. We don't actually know which one it was. I lean towards the intentional fallacy aspect of this and trying not to read too much into Shakespeare's real life by reading what he wrote in the sonnet, but you can make your own decision. I'll link you over to some extra reading in the show notes. So exactly when were these sonnets published? Well, officially they were published in 1609 as a part of a collection that was called Shakespeares Sonnets, and it was all 154 sonnets plus a longer poem, all put there together in one book. And that's like its official publication date. But you have to remember that these sonnets were written for individuals, and so During the late 1590s and early 1600s, these sonnets and poems were widely distributed and received to great popular acclaim while Shakespeare was working. And so while the official publication was not until 1609, his sonnets were available well before then. And actually in 1599, a book called The Passionate Pilgrim was compiled, and Shakespeare's Sonnets 128 and 144 were included in that selection as well. Famously, sonnets 127 through 152 are known as Shakespeare's Dark Lady Sonnets. Personally, I think Shakespeare was not actually writing to a woman lover in these sonnets, but instead was expressing his love and the frustrated love that this causes for the theater itself. Shakespeare was living in London and writing and working because of his love of the stage and for theater, while his family and his children were living back in Stratford. While we have records of Shakespeare visiting his family as often as he could, sending money back to them whenever he could, and he retired and moved back to Stratford himself when that became an option for him and he'd achieved enough success to do that. And so we know that emotionally Shakespeare was split between living in London and pursuing his love of the theater and having his wife and his children back in Stratford. So when you read through the Dark Lady Sonnets, things like the dark, wiry hair and could also talk about the theater itself and the strings that were used to achieve special effects on stage, and a lot of the metaphors that are in there could just be poetic metaphors describing his love for the theater as opposed to giving away or confessing to some kind of illicit affair. Although I'm sure if your family is back in Stratford and you find yourself leaving the love of your life to go and serve your passion in London, that you would find the affair language to be quite appropriate to how it makes you feel. But that's just my opinion. I wrote a full article on this and I'll link to that in the show notes as well. So lots going on in the show notes today. That's it for this week here at Did Shakespeare. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. If you liked this video, please hit like and subscribe. Every like and subscribe that this video gets helps this material reach more people. And as you know, as Shakespeareans, we love our friends. So please hit the like button and become our friend, and I'll see you next week. Don't forget, in the show notes, there is also a link to the Dark Lady Sonnets article. There is both a full article that explains why I think Shakespeare's Dark Lady was actually his love for the theater, and there's a freebie there. If you sign up to join That Shakespeare Girl newsletter, you get the freebie included, and I send out freebies like that and a diagram of the globe and all of the $5 downloads that are available in That Shakespeare shop. You get them for free when you sign up for the email list. So if you are teaching a class or you're involved in a Shakespeare book group or conference and you would like to have this kind of material to give out to your attendees, signing up for That Shakespeare Girl newsletter gives you a free way to have access to those because I do send them out regularly. So check that out and more down below in the show notes, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.